So, Coach Trisciani, what do you think?
It's great. It's great to be in a full church again and with y'all.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you for inviting the guys over today and the First Lady of Elon football. Hi, Julie. Coach, there's an old saying that says every now and then a guy outpunches coverage. That'd be true of you and me when we got married, so we're glad you're here. And this church, I think you already know this, Trish, but this church is totally supportive of me giving some time and volunteer energies to the program at Elon, and for you to open the door wide is it's an honor for me and this church, for sure. So thanks a lot for that. You'll have a chance to meet the guys after church. They'll be hanging out a little bit in the lobby, so please do that. Pray with me. So, God, we come before you now, and we open up your word as we do every single time when we gather. Show us something fresh that we've not seen before. Give us an insight that would spur us to change something, impact something, influence something, pray about something. We honor you, Christ. We're all about making you famous, Jesus, and we pray in that name. And those who agree with the prayer said, amen. All right, so let me introduce you to the Disher family. I'm going to need to turn the clock back to the mid-60s. That'd be 20th century. Bob Sr., his wife Bobby, and their 3 kids. Bob Jr., that'd be me. His brother Eric, 5 years younger, and their younger sister Laura, who came along 5 years after that. Bob Sr. was a sales rep in a heating and air conditioning industry. Bobby was a stay-at-home mom, both in their late 30s. Bob Jr., that'd be me, was an emerging teenager. My little brother was in elementary school. He lived in his own little bubble. Now, for those of you, plenty of y'all know my brother, and so you know that you're right, he never got out of the bubble. He's still there. And my sister Laura was toddling around in La La Land. Well, we 3 kids were the newest members of the baby boomer generation. And many of us who are in that generation, our dads, some of you like mine, my dad spent 3 years of his life deployed in Western Europe, fighting against Nazi Germany in World War II. Many of these men came home after the war and they got married and they started having kids, and well, they had a lot of kids. Hometown, Lexington, North Carolina, a modest southern town in central North Carolina where barbecue is king and the simple life was queen. Life was slow, normal, and we liked it like that. But change was in the air. Teenagers were dreaming about cruising in a brand new 1964 product that had just come off the line from the Ford Motor Company, the Mustang. New Mustang in 1964, $2,300. I don't know what color that was. You could get it any color you want. The music that we were listening to, it included the vibrations of Elvis, Frankie Valli, the Four Seasons, this long-haired group from Great Britain, the Beatles, the sweet soul sounds of Motown and R&B. The Beach Boys were singing about good vibrations, and how could we have ever known in the mid-60s that Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones could be so prophetic when they gave us a musical gift? You remember the words? When I'm driving in my car and the man comes on the radio, he's telling me more and more about some useless information supposed to fire my imagination, but I can't get no satisfaction. And so it was in the 1960s. Beginning around 1965, there was change out there on the horizon. In November 1963, we were stunned in disbelief when our president was assassinated on the streets of Dallas, Texas. There was civil rights unrest on almost every street in America. Battle lines were being drawn in Southeast Asia that was exploding into an all-out controversial and very unpopular war in Vietnam that would eventually claim the lives of more than 58,000 young Americans. Some of those names on that monument were high school friends of mine. In 1960, as I was turning 8 years old, it was impossible for Americans to know that by the time the 60s turned 70, the baby boomers would be right smack in the crosshairs of a cultural revolution that included a nasty Cold War and space race with the Soviet Union. Civil rights were becoming a necessary priority across our land, and a new subculture of young Americans were about to unleash themselves, devoted to defiance and rebellion and revolution, known as hippies. There was a sense that something was broken. Nobody seemed to know what it was, and even those who did couldn't figure out how to fix it. I had no idea that I was an evolving teenager in what would be someday labeled as the most volatile decade of the 20th century. The Disher family traveled in their trusty Chevrolet sedan with bench seats. You guys will have to ask somebody what those are. Little sister Laura would sit in the front seat between my parents. My brother and I were in the back seat. Seatbelts not required, seatbelts non-existent. Because the only safety restraints we had, the only ones we needed, was a parent's arm slung across us to prevent us from flying through the windshield in case of a sudden stop. That sedan would eventually give way to the family station wagon that would eventually morph into a minivan that sooner or later would emerge in the 21st century as this big honking SUV. The Dishers had dinner almost every night at a small round table in the sitting area of the kitchen. Seat assignments, same every night. Somebody would typically say the blessing. Mostly, God is great, God is good, you know. The weekend routine never changed all that much. Every Saturday night, you polish your one pair of dress shoes, up early on Sunday morning for breakfast, and then you got dressed with wool pants, dress shirt, clip-on tie, and you had to promptly be in the car at 8:30. We had a 10-minute drive to the family church, Second Reformed Church in Lexington, Sunday school, church, listen to a sermon every Sunday. We were there if we weren't sick. We sat in the same location in that sanctuary every week. Y'all know how church people are, don't you? We were the fifth row back, straight in front of the pulpit. Our pastor had been there about 40 years. He was a strong communicator. He preached for 20 minutes, told great stories. He would eventually become one of the mentors, one of the wisest mentors that I ever had. By the way, he officiated at my ordination service in January of '78, just 6 weeks before he died very suddenly. I had a personal Bible that my parents gave me on my 10th birthday. It was Revised Standard Version. What else? But what a relief from the King James. Woo. Church was a good thing. It was a positive experience. That it was the primary place where we learned the Bible stories. We sang and memorized some of the great hymns of faith, where we learned moral lessons that were taught at home but reinforced by the church. And it's where we had a chance to wear our new dress-up clothes that I mentioned, wool pants and a clip-on tie. The Dishers were the conventional, traditional, stand-up, all-American family in the 60s because we were living right at the heart of the Bible Belt. The Bible Belt is commonly known as the region in the southern part of the United States where socially conservative Christianity plays a strong role in culture and school and politics and the social order. There were also some explosive changes on the landscape of the American church about to happen. In fact, from the years about 1960 to 1980, historians now look back at that 20-year period and they call it an awakening. A great awakening, actually, the fourth great awakening in American history. There was this increase in the influence of the evangelical church and the charismatic movement. With leading voices like Billy Graham, Martin Luther King, and Pope John Paul II, there was a wake-up call. And it was resonating across almost every local church in America. There was a major impact of about the 50 million evangelical Christians in the country, which, by the way, was 1 out of 4 Americans in those days, demonstrating an increased interest in what it would take to have a spiritual revitalization. How would Christianity influence our world? And then I'll tell you, when America elected a Southern Baptist as the president in 1976, we were wondering what in the world is going to be next. Were the Dishers a Christian family? We thought so. We checked all the boxes that would indicate as much. Simple lifestyle, wrapped up in the principles, things like morality, honesty, integrity, prayer at dinner. We were a family where the Bible was more than a decoration on the coffee table. Sunday school and church on Sunday. We went to vacation Bible school in the summer. Dad was an elder on the governing board. My mother was a member of the Women's Guild, led the exercise class at our church. Has the trend changed in the last 55 years? A lot. Can you say polyester? No more wool pants. Let me show you a picture of the decline in America in the decades since I was born. And I'll show you what will sometimes just sort of unnerve you when you take a broader look at how we were downgraded. I'm talking about Christianity, disregarded, dishonored, marginalized, and even discarded by millions of Americans. This world was saying, hey, you people who follow Jesus, y'all are out of touch, you're out of step, you're on the wrong side of history. Take a look at this. 1952, the year I was born, faith was pretty high. 75% was considered to be, 75% of Americans considered faith to be a big deal, and then the decline. Notice that when we got to the decade of the 60s and the 70s, things bottomed out. It was a tumultuous era. There was kind of a sort of an up and down period right during the 80s and 90s. This was the awakening period. We moved into the 21st century, and this survey was done in 2019. 54% now of Americans who believe that faith is a big deal. Let's forward to 1977. I married my high school heartthrob in 73. So in 77, Susan and I had been married for 4 years. We were both in our mid-20s. I was in the final semester of graduate school at Duke Divinity School. I was on my way to ordination. I was preparing that fall I had to sit before the ecclesiastical council, which simply meant that I had to defend my ordination paper and my theological positions. And who could have guessed it, that only 5 months later, I would become the 14th pastor of a rock-solid church on St. Mark's Church Road, with a tradition that stretched back into the mid-19th century. You probably don't think of this very often, but this church now stretches across portions of 3 centuries. Does that kind of blow your mind? The 19th, the 20th, and the 21st. In the fall of 77, I'm just a few months away from ordination. I'm in my final semester at Duke. I was sitting in a 500 level class at the seminary. There were 6 other guys in the room, and we were all enthusiastic and eager. We were thinking, man, pretty soon we're gonna be out of here. We're gonna be storming the gates of hell. We had these visions that we would change the world in our generation. 3 of us were from North Carolina, 1 from Arkansas, 1 from Connecticut, and 1 from some foreign country, a place that he called the Bay Area of Northern California. I remember one class session when the guy from Connecticut looked at the 3 of us from North Carolina and he said, man, you guys have it easy here in the South. Everybody's a Christian. It's not like that where I'm from. No, everybody's skeptical of the church, Christianity, and religion is. Where I'm from, it feels almost more like I'm going to a foreign country and I'm going out to the foreign mission field. Us North Carolina people were thinking, it stinks to be you. Our professor, he kind of let the conversation go for a while, and then he said some words that stopped me in my tracks. Here's what he said, and I'm obviously paraphrasing. He said, let me tell you something, gentlemen. The Bible Belt is the most difficult place in America to be a pastor and to lead a church. And at that very time, I was serving 2 small churches in Southern Virginia. I was a student pastor. And then he said something that didn't make much sense. He said, most of the people in Bible Belt churches are Christians in name only, but they're not sold out to Jesus and the gospel. And I thought, the dude is a professor in the divinity school. What does he know about it? He doesn't lead a church or anything. All the people in my 2 little churches were devoted Christians. And boy, was I in for a shock. Here's a summary of what he said that day that gave me serious pause. But to this day, it's hard for me to imagine how prophetic he was. And these words would eventually influence my future and the future of this church. Here's what he said. Gentlemen, in California and Connecticut, there is no confusion. You are either a Christian or not. In the Bible Belt, people are confused. Nearly everybody thinks they're Christians, but they don't have much concept about how sin works and the need to repent or to turn in a new direction. He said people in the Bible Belt believe that they know the gospel, they just don't know how it works. What I did not know at that point was that he was giving me, at least, I don't know about the other guys, the first introduction into what we define today as 3 classifications of believers in name only. I introduced this to you last week. Cultural, casual, and unsaved Christians. Cultural and casual Christian. Here's what they say. Well, let's say I'm not an atheist. I'm not an agnostic. I'm not Muslim or Jewish or Buddhist. Well, there's only one thing left. I must be a Christian. These are people who make mistakes, but doesn't everybody? After all, a casual Christian will sometimes tell you, I'm banking on God curving the grades when I have to face him someday. At least they convince themselves that they're better than most when they compare themselves with their neighbors and coworkers and teammates, and so they cram into the minivan or SUV on Easter and Christmas, and they go to church, but they don't have a whole lot of concept about why those holidays matter on Monday and Tuesday. And what my professor was describing way before we had ever heard the terms of casual or cultural Christians was something that was about to happen in America that was brand new. Quite frankly, in 2021, cultural Christianity is probably being practiced by more Americans than any of the other faith traditions ever. You will find cultural Christians in Catholic churches and Protestant churches. You'll find them in the South and the Midwest, in New England and out on the West Coast. And you'll see them everywhere in between. You'll see them gathered this fall in high school and college football stadiums, patriotic holiday celebrations around. You'll see them gathered around their family dinner table. Their faith looks and sounds like the real thing, like biblical Christianity. But as Dean and Sarah writes in his 2019 book, he says, it's merely Christian by culture rather than conviction. The gospel of Jesus Christ is not a part of the equation. These are suburban cul-de-sac people hosting a neighborhood cookout to watch the game. They believe in God, they take their Christian traditions seriously, pray before and after games, nativity scenes in public places, Linus reciting the Christmas story in A Charlie Brown Christmas. They just don't believe that their sin has done anything to separate them from God or to cause them to need the Jesus they claim to believe in. Wow, what if he's right? Well, let me take you to the greatest sermon Jesus ever gave, greatest sermon in the history of the world. Quite frankly, Jesus says, go in through the narrow gate. The gate to destruction is wide, and the road that leads there is easy to follow. A lot of people, casual Christians, go through that gate, but the gate to life is very narrow. The road that leads there is hard to follow, that only a few fully devoted Christian people find it. Wow, what if he's right? I'm just curious, quick show of hands, how many of y'all had an imaginary friend when you were a little kid? Well, not many of us. I had two. Their names were Alway and Chokey. Now, don't laugh because, let me tell you something, if you had a little brother like I did, you'd have had imaginary friends too. A while back, a guy told me that, he said, you know what, Bob? Jesus is kind of like my imaginary friend. And I said, you mean sort of like a good luck charm? And he said, yep, that's about it. Casual Christians. These are the people that will most typically have bumper stickers, like Christians are not perfect, just forgiven, and little fish stickers on their bumper, and they have cross-stitch quotes on the walls of their living room, like, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, or faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love, or maybe Psalm 23. Their favorite tune is probably, a Christian tune is probably Amazing Grace, but they have a hard time, if you ask them, so what is grace all about? They have a hard time figuring that out. God is often referred to by these people as a higher power or a spiritual force, or sometimes it's the man upstairs. Cultural, casual Christians can sometimes go months or maybe even years without ever needing God, but then suddenly there's a crisis that strikes and they realize that these Christian good luck charms are not working anymore, so they panic and now they've got to figure out how to move God from the back seat to the driver's seat. What I learned after moving to St. Mark's Church here in 1978 is that West Burlington was saturated with cultural Christians. They understood the basic Christian lingo, but they didn't know the basics of the gospel. Cultural Christians are probably the most over-churched and under-reached group in our country today. They claim to be religious, but when you ask, so how do your Christian beliefs and practices, how do those things influence things like your lifestyle, your morality, your habits, your marriage, your family values, your workplace decisions? They will look at you with confusion and say, I didn't know it was supposed to work like that. I had a brief but powerful conversation with a man just last week after one of our services out in the lobby, an older gentleman. And he was talking to me about the possibility of being baptized in a couple of weeks on August 29th. And he said, Bob, I have been a church attender as long as I can remember. My parents had me baptized when I was a baby. I guess you could say I've pretty much been attending church most of my life. But it was just recently when I began to figure out what the Bible really says. I always thought I was fine, he said, but I'm not sure now. You know what we almost never talked about 45 years ago when I was in the seminary? How to reach people like that. We never talked about it because we all thought they're fine. Everything's good. But what if they're not? Maybe I missed that class, I don't know. But I'll tell you what, I've learned the lesson the hard way. Getting somebody convinced that he or she is maybe not a follower of Jesus, even when they're convinced that they are, requires a delicate, sensitive kind of conversation. But we're not the first people to have to deal with this one. When Jesus preached this most powerful sermon, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, he went straight at it. Most of the time he could get away with it. Here's what he said. I'm still in Matthew 7. Not everyone who calls me their Lord will get into the kingdom of heaven. Only the ones who obey my Father in heaven will get in. On the day of judgment, many will call me Lord. They will say, we preached in your name, and in your name we forced out demons, and we worked many miracles. But I will tell them, I never knew you. You kidding me? Now let's be clear. Jesus was not speaking to atheists and agnostics that day. In fact, most of the people who were gathered around him listening to that sermon were probably religious veterans. And if you checked, they probably had a very impressive religious resume. These were genuinely religious people. But they could not understand that the man standing in front of them was soon to be the Redeemer of the world. Most of the people gathered around Jesus that day listening to that sermon, they were just like the 1960s Disher family. It was hard for us to accept that we were on the wide road that could lead to destruction, especially since we had this pretty cool religious pedigree. Ask me in 1965. I would have told you, I'm fine. I'm good. But what was happening then was my eternal security was grounded in things like heritage and values and rites of passage. Like I remember my first communion and my confirmation and baptized as a baby so all of those things were kind of on my resume, but nothing about the redemptive work of Christ on the cross. One of the most difficult challenges in all of life is to have God say, I noticed that you had a prayer before dinner, you believed in prayer in the public schools, you attended church, you leaned on the man upstairs. When you got in trouble, you looked up and you got tears in your eyes at patriotic celebrations. You gave money to the church. You owned a Bible. You had your children christened. You only drove 5 miles over the speed limit, never any more than that. You got goosebumps singing God Bless America at a baseball game. You even had your Olin Mills picture in the church pictorial directory. So that proves your allegiance. And then to hear Jesus say, your Christian religious resume is impressive. Your ancestry is outstanding. Willingness to wear your wool pants and clip-on tie, that was good. But we never got acquainted. I never knew you. I appreciated an email I received last week following our services, and this person said, Bob, I'm grateful for your passion, but do you think Jesus would reject those who have never heard about him? Well, that's a $64,000 question, isn't it? Actually, it's probably more like the $1 million question. What about the millions of people around planet Earth who have never heard about the name and legacy of Jesus? Well, I've just got to say, that's way outside of my authority, but that's not who Jesus was talking to here. He was always extending mercy to those situations that don't always make sense to us. And I share his greater concern, not for those who have never heard, but instead for those who have heard, maybe many times, and yet they still continue to turn their backs with a measure of defiance or just plain old indifference, casual, cultural Christians. I'm personally relieved that my eternal security is not based on my heritage or my family of origin or the rites of passage like baptism and confirmation or my religious checklist like church attendance, read the Bible, prayed when I got in a pinch. But everything is anchored on the redemptive work of Jesus on the cross. Now, this was especially hard for a kid like me growing up in the Bible Belt South because everybody just assumed that they were Christians. And it was hard because when somebody started telling me that my goodness resume and my heritage wasn't going to work, that I needed to lean on Jesus and the cross. Let me illustrate why this message about why the work of Christ and his cross is so critically important. I've got some medicines here in my possession. And if I told you that these meds were recently released by one of the leading medical research firms in America, not the one that Dr. Fauci leaves. The boy's a little confused sometimes, isn't he? But what if I gave you the absolute assurance that a group of some of the smartest medical scientists have come together and they have created the series of medications that will cure almost every major disease on the planet today. For example, this one is labeled heart disease. Neurological, like ALS, Alzheimer's, and strokes. Here's one. Breast cancer. Brain cancer. Viruses. COVID. If I told you that these medications have been tested, they're safe, they have been approved by the FDA and the CDC, but in the interest of, we don't want to get a whole bunch of people right now because we've got this political hullabaloo going on, so I'm going to wait a few years to release these medications. You would say, Bob, your selfish egotism is bordering on criminal, and in all likelihood, you would never trust me ever again, rightfully so. Yes? Sure. But some of the same people who would consider my silence to be the worst form of disingenuous hypocrisy and injustice, they get bent all out of shape when I have the audacity to say that I have all the information needed to answer the sin, the depravity, the careless moral choices that we make. And yet sometimes this world will scream at us and tell us, you keep that message confined inside your church building. We don't want to hear it. It's absurd for us to think that a 2,000 years old, time-honored answers for the problems of evil and immorality and human brokenness and dysfunction, these have been tried and tested and found true in every generation since Jesus walked on this planet. And they have been proved to be the only reliable antidote to our moral issues and our spiritual poverty. If I told you that I have the answers, I have the solution to our perverted challenges of pride and greed and marital breakdown and child abuse and neglect and every form of addictive behavior you can imagine, and all the corporate corruption and egregious law breaking on Main Street and on your street, and cruelty and hatred, bigotry and intolerance and racism, immorality, every kind of malicious evil. But I'm not going to tell anybody about the solution. Why are more people not jumping up and down and demanding that this message be heard? I grew up with a safe and protective spiritual family tree. A lot of us kids did back in the 50s and early 60s America. My parents gave my gave me and my younger brother and sister an opportunity to see what a strong, devoted marriage could be like. They were married for 62 years before my dad died. Mom's still living. They demonstrated to all three of us something about the devotion to the plans and priorities of God. I will always be grateful to be covered in some of those good memories of life in the Bible Belt. If my dad said it once, he said it 100 times. Son, if you always do the right thing, you won't be caught doing a bunch of wrong things. That's not exactly profound, but it's good wisdom. How many times was I headed out on a Saturday night as a teenager, or even when I was a 20-year-old college student dating Susan, and my mom would say, just remember who you are. She wasn't concerned that I was going to forget my identity, but it was important to her that I represent our family's spiritual legacy with honor and integrity. We were a well-rounded family in the 1960s, Bible Belt America. And if you had asked me as a 15, 16-year-old kid if I was a Christian, I would have thought, that's an absurd question. Of course I'm a Christian. We checked all the religious boxes. We would roll into the church parking lot every Sunday, 9:45, Sunday school, church, listen to a sermon. And somebody had convinced me that that was enough. Neither my parents, my seasoned pastor, my Sunday school teachers, they were not trying to deceive me. They just didn't tell me the whole story. I needed someone who would tell me the gospel straight up. And that's when the Fellowship of Christian Athletes entered my life. Many of you know that story, but my African-American high school football and baseball coach, oh my gosh, that's Coach England. Phil, I love that man. He's been gone a while, but wow. Devoted follower of Christ. He was a football, baseball coach at our high school. He became a fabulous mentor to me and so many other kids at Lexington High School. During my junior baseball season, Coach England said, hey, Dish, I want you to help me start an FCA chapter here at the school. And one of his encouragements to me personally, he said, but I want you to attend an FCA conference this summer, which was the summer of '69, which I agreed to do it reluctantly. But that decision led me to Rome, Georgia for a week on the campus of Berry College the first week of August with about 300 other guys from all across the Southeast United States. The keynote speaker that week was Bobby Richardson. He had just retired as an all-star with an all-star career with the New York Yankees. And he, for many, many years, ever since I was a little boy, he was one of my childhood heroes. This is what he was like when I met him the first time. He was only a couple of years out of retirement with the Yankees. This is the Bobby and Betsy Richardson that Susan and I know today. That Friday night of FCA camp was the first time the story of Jesus and how he had relentlessly pursued me, it started to make sense. Probably because I didn't know Bobby Richardson, but I had admired him for a long time. When he was finished with his talk that night, at Bobby's invitation, I gave my life to Jesus. It was August the 8th, 1969. It was exactly 52 years ago last Sunday. Bobby and I continue our 50-plus years friendship even now. That night, here's the passage that he preached on. Jesus says, my sheep respond to my voice, and I know who they are. They follow me, and I give them eternal life. They will never be lost, and no one will tear them away from me. My Father who gave them to me is greater than everyone else, and no one can tear them away from my Father. I'm telling you, everybody, that night I heard the voice of Jesus, not audibly, but it was resonating from Bobby Richardson. And he said, if you get a sense that you're hearing the voice of Jesus tonight, listen to what he's saying to you and say yes to him. Just say yes. And then one of the great Yankee baseball players of all times, believe it or not, used a football metaphor that I have never forgotten. He said, some of you young men are high school football players, and your coach is gonna, every single Friday night, he's going to encourage you to win the turnover battle. Trish, I've heard that one many times before. And here's what he said. He said, if you were a fireman and you rushed into a burning house and there was a 6-month-old baby and you grabbed that baby out of the crib and you picked her up and you were headed for the outside, you wouldn't let anything or anybody cause you to drop that baby. If you're carrying the football, never let anybody take it from you. That's what he said. And then he said, if you say yes to Jesus, nothing or nobody will take you away from him except you if you turn your back on him. It was probably the first time that I had ever truly heard the gospel message. Probably not the first time, but I'm 17 years old, but it was the gospel, you see, spoken by a man that I had held in high regard, even though I never knew him. And he shared the message that night in a winsome, compelling way, and I found it irresistible. I couldn't just sit there. And a few minutes later, when Bobby gave an invitation to follow Jesus, I knew what I had to do. I approached him. I was so nervous. I mean, have you ever tried to meet your childhood hero? I was so nervous. And you know what I said to him? I'm a pretty good church kid. I go to church a lot, but I don't belong to Jesus. He said, you want to? I said, oh yeah. He put his arms around me, we prayed, I received Christ. That was the night I learned that the gospel is Jesus plus nothing. It's not Jesus plus church or Sunday school or vacation Bible school or read the Bible a bunch of times or pray table blessings before dinner or whatever else is on your religious checklist, just Jesus. That's it, Jesus plus nothing. And we parted that night, and Bobby reminded me. He just said, hey, grabbed me by the shirt sleeve, and he said, it will forever be up to you to live more like Jesus. The last opportunity that Susan and I had to attend the Masters Golf Tournament at Augusta National was it was as memorable as the other few times we've been there. It was a great day, but you know something, every day at Augusta National is a good day. We got to see some of the great professionals in the world. Plus, it's a little bonus to be able to eat the pimento cheese and egg salad sandwiches if you ever go to Augusta. Late in the afternoon, we were leaving the tournament on the way to our car, and there was a man standing along Berkman's Road, which is the street that separates the parking lot from the golf course. And there was a man standing there, and he had this huge sign that said, accept Jesus now or wind up in hell forever. And he was just screaming to the crowd, all of us that were leaving the tournament. Well, you know me, my first thought was, I think I'll stop and talk to this guy. Maybe I can get him to redirect his message, maybe toward the love of Jesus that compels us instead of the wrath of Jesus that repels us. But I had a 4-hour drive back to North Carolina, so I just kept moving. There's a guy walking right here beside me, and he said, can you believe these religious nutcases? And I said, you think he's crazy? Don't you? And I said, well, I don't know. It's kind of hard to judge without talking to the guy. The man shot back at me and said, that man right there is crazy. And I said, what if he's telling the truth, but he just has got a bad delivery system? And he said, I'm telling you, the dude is nuts. You know, my guess is that sign-carrying, loud-shouting, finger-pointing guy at the Masters, I'd almost bet you that he was talking about something pretty important. Only he was sharing the message in such a weird, crazy way. Thousands of people were in earshot of what he was saying, and probably most of them said, that man is crazy. You know, they called Jesus crazy once, do you remember? Even his family his brothers and sisters. One time Jesus entered a house and the crowds began to gather again. Soon he and his disciples couldn't even find time to eat. When his family heard what was happening, they tried to take him away. He's out of his mind, they said. The teachers of religious law who had arrived in Jerusalem said, they're talking about Jesus. He's possessed by Satan, the prince of demons. Coach England taught me more about baseball than anybody else. But he said, Dish, I want you to attend the FCA conference this summer, and then me and you will try to start a chapter right here. What my coach did not tell me, which of course he didn't know, is the first week of August 1969, my life was about to change radically, forever. And so far, Jesus has not dropped me once, even though I'm sure I've been a disappointment to him plenty of times. I did come back from Rome, Georgia that August, my senior year in high school. Coach England helped me. We started an FCA chapter at Lexington Senior High School. But let me tell you something, listen carefully. It was not so much what we started as it was what God started in me. My friends, look, don't wait for invitations to go to the things that God has already invited you to. Just RSVP. That's all Bobby Richardson said. Just say yes. Just say, I'm coming. I'll be there. One of these days, my life is going to come to an end. I understand that. But I'll tell you, when I stand before God, I will not be standing alone. Oh, no. I'll be standing beside my big brother, Jesus, and I will expect him to say, Dad, this is Bob. He got here by the narrow road. He's one of ours. I sure do love you, SMC.